All right. As I said, Dr. Jonathan Rynhold from Bar-Ilan University is a director at the Argov Center for the Study of Israel and the Jewish People, the deputy head of the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, a senior researcher at the BESA Center for Strategic Studies, senior lecturer at Bar-Ilan University. He was a visiting professor of Israel Studies at the George Washington University just a year or two ago, tutorial fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the Department of International Relations, and I believe, your PhD also is from the London School of Economics, and we are very pleased that you have taken some of your evening this evening here in Israel to join us on the American Friends of Likud Insiders Briefing and Conference Call to give us, as we said in the email, and some insight and analysis to Israel's electoral challenge after we have just completed the Likud primaries. I'd ask you to, if you can, give us your take on it for a few moments before we turn it over to the questions and answers, hopefully, that will ensue. Now, once again, just I have to remind everyone, if you'd like to ask a question of Dr. Rynhold during the call, please send your question to info@aslikud.org, and I will do my best to have your question asked during the course of the call. Without further ado, I turn it over to you, Dr. Rynhold.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome everyone to the conference call. There's been much talk in Israel about these elections as a referendum on Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership, and there have been many polls showing a decline in support for Netanyahu, and polls showing, for example, that the Labour Party is close in the number of seats projected in polls to the Likud Party. But I think all of that is largely irrelevant and besides the point. Israeli politics is not a game of parties, it's a game of blocks. There are 120 seats in the Knesset, and the objective of any leader who wishes to be Prime Minister is to first and foremost create a blocking majority of 61 seats in the Knesset. Now, there are two big blocks in Israeli politics. One is the right and the ultra-Orthodox, and the other is the center, the left, and Israeli Arabs. Now, these are not coalitions that will necessarily or even likely to form an Israeli government, but they form a blocking majority. That is, if the ultra-Orthodox and the right together get more than 60 seats, they get 61 or more, then their candidate will be Prime Minister, because he will be the only candidate that can command a majority in the Knesset. And the same is true in reverse. If the centre, the left, and the Israeli Arabs manage to get more than 61 seats, 60 or 61 or more, then their candidate will be the only one who will be able to get a majority. This is slightly less true in the case of the Israeli Arab centre and left bloc, because the Israeli Arabs are unlikely to join in a full way any left government, but they could still block a right-wing government. So that is really the first question that one has to ask before one gets to parties and who's up and who's down. And if we look at that, what we see is that most of the polls show that seats are being redistributed within blocks and not shifting across blocks. The Jewish Home, or Bayit HaYehudi, is up and the Likud is down, or the Likud goes up and Lieberman's party, Israel Beitenu, goes down. But the overall number of seats on the right doesn't change. The same with the ultra-Orthodox, and incidentally the same with the centre. If one looks at the number of seats on the centre-left of Labour taken together with Yesh Atid in the current Knesset, it's about the same as what is predicted for Labour, Yesh Atid, and Kahlon's new centrist party. In other words, there doesn't seem to be much movement between blocks. Most of what's happening seems to be within blocks. So the big question then is there anything, is there any way or any party or any issue that can move votes between blocks and therefore shift the balance? Right now, The polls indicate, and the current Knesset shows, that the right and the ultra-Orthodox have a blocking majority. So the question would then be, is there any way that they might lose that in an election? So there are several potential issues. A traditional issue is peace and security. In other words, in the past, that part of the Israeli public which shifts between left and right and centre in elections have shifted in the past on the issue of peace and security. They shifted in 1992 towards Labour when they felt that Yitzhak Rabin, as a former chief of staff, was solid on security, and so he was able to hold the security card while claiming that Yitzhak Shamir was too ideological. In 1996, Netanyahu managed to gain at the benefit of Perez by saying, I represent security, there are suicide bombings going on, and you need to come to me. In 1999, Ehud Barak took that back on the same basis as Rabin. He is a former chief of staff. This time, it is unlikely that votes would shift from right to left on the basis of anything to do with peace and security. This is for two reasons. First of all, the centre and the left do not have a Rabin-Barak-like candidate, a former chief of staff who the public will trust on security, and if he's more willing to make compromises in the political or diplomatic arena with the Palestinians, can credibly say, I'm not damaging security. There isn't one of those. Herzog isn't like that, isn't perceived to be like that. Livni isn't perceived to be like that, and Yair Lapid is not perceived to be like that. So that is unlikely to be an issue, specifically as the public is generally very, very, very skeptical about the chances of negotiations and peace. So in any case, there's not much traction on that issue, which is different from the 1990s when it was a live issue and widely debated, and which there was some traction on that issue. Another possibility in the foreign policy arena which could possibly shift votes is the relationship with the United States. Recent polling done by Bar-Ilan showed that relations with the United States are deemed by Israelis the second most important element in Israeli security, only superseded by Israel's military power itself. In other words, the relationship with the US is perceived by Israelis to be more important than territory, and more important also than peace agreements. So both left and right, lose out on the issues that divide them because they agree that actually relations with the US trumps everything. So the question then becomes is who is responsible for the perceived poor state of relationship between the American administration and the Israeli government. So critics of Netanyahu could claim that there's very bad relationships between Obama and Netanyahu, and that Netanyahu, by building settlements every time something happens, is needlessly aggravating the American administration. Netanyahu can turn around and say, well, look at Obama's policies on Iran, look at Obama's policies on ISIS, look at Obama's policies on the peace process. Do you think those are good policies, or do you think I did the right thing by standing up to him? And the interesting thing, public opinion would probably nod at both of those claims. In other words, when one asks, do you think Obama's is favourable towards Israel? Israelis are divided straight down the middle. Just over a third think he is sympathetic to Israel, just over a third think he's not, and the rest think he's neutral or don't know. When asked, is Netanyahu doing a good job of managing the relationship with the US, a slim majority of about 41, 42 to 35, 36 think Netanyahu is doing a good job. In other words, yes, more think he's doing a good job than not, but it's very finely balanced. It's a narrow margin, so 7, 8%. And when you think that the margin of error in polling is 4%, that's a very small difference. So potentially the American relationship and how it's handled could be an issue. And it's interesting that Moshe Kahlon has taken the former Israeli ambassador to America, Michael Oren, to be on his list. But I doubt it will play a major role because at the end of the day, for Israelis, for two-thirds of Israelis, they think that Obama's policies on Iran, on ISIS, and on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process are bad. So even if they think he might like Israel, there's a significant amount of Israelis who think he is okay with Israel itself, but they think his policies are bad. So I don't see that as an issue which could move votes between the blocs. The issues that could move votes from the right to the centre or the left are domestic issues. In other words, for Israelis, the cost of living issue is a very, very big one, and it's one that was very, very important to Israelis in the past election. And the other issue which is related to that is the sense that the ultra-Orthodox really do need to serve in the army, and that there's a great disdain for paying the price of a coalition with the ultra-Orthodox by funding their institutions, the yeshivot and things like that, when they don't serve in the army, when a relatively large percentage of their male population doesn't work. So on that issue, Netanyahu is more vulnerable, because when it came to the issue of drafting the ultra-Orthodox, and when it came to the issue of dealing with non-Orthodox, easing the path to conversion in Israel, when it came to the cost of living, Netanyahu opposed the initiatives taken by some of the centrist parties, Yesh Atid in particular, and other people. And so he is potentially vulnerable on those issues for not delivering on standard of living and dealing with the ultra-Orthodox and those kind of things. Now, particularly if voters think he's going to be Prime Minister anyway, those who might agree with him on foreign policy may vote for more centrist candidates on the basis of trying to punish him for not dealing with the long-range issues in the domestic arena, on the assumption that they will just get a coalition which is more led by Netanyahu, but which has centrist parties which can exert influence and pressure on those second issues in the domestic arena which they care about. But of course the consequence of that may be to actually shift who is going to be Prime Minister. But even here, I think it would be very surprising if the centre were able to take 5 seats from the right and therefore get an overall majority in the Knesset of centre-left and the Arabs. I think the main issue which could determine who's Prime Minister will not be determined at the ballot box, but is in coalition negotiations, and as a result of the raising of the threshold in Israel for achieving a seat in the Knesset. By raising the threshold for a party, you now need probably 4 seats to get into the Knesset. That means that when Shas split in 2, it's possible that one half or both halves of Shas may not cross the threshold, and that those votes will then be redistributed on a proportional basis to all the other parties, and therefore the right and the ultra-Orthodox will lose some seats. The second thing that could happen is that Lieberman, who desires to replace Netanyahu as the candidate of the right, has been saying, well, I'm not necessarily part of this right ultra-Orthodox coalition. I may go with the other side. This would then mean that Netanyahu would not be Prime Minister, and Lieberman then at a later date could leave that coalition and become the candidate of the right. The ultra-Orthodox, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox parties may say, well, you left us out in the last government, so we're not necessarily going to go with you this time. In other words, what could cost the right and Netanyahu the prime ministership is not the result of the elections per se, but the fact that the coherence of his bloc is shaky, and therefore he can't necessarily count on the other right-wing parties and the other ultra-Orthodox parties backing him to be the candidate for Prime Minister. They may go elsewhere. Lieberman has been a part of centrist-led coalitions before. Shas has been part of centre-left coalitions before. So that's not unprecedented. So in many ways, I think some of the more interesting elements of the election will actually come after we've voted rather than before. And on that note, I shall hand back to you if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rynhold. I'm going to be asking the questions, and obviously, not obviously, but perhaps for those who don't know, if you'd like to ask a question, please email it as we sit here on the call to info@aflikud.org, and I will do my best to have your question asked today here on the call. First, it's an interesting phenomenon, though, that you had mentioned, because every day, if you look at the polls, they show either Likud or Labor either neck and neck, or one being the other slightly ahead, one way or the other. And then if you look further down in the same survey, which I don't think a lot of people necessarily do when they just look at the graph at the top, it asks who is best suited to be prime minister, and invariably the percentages tilt toward Bibi Netanyahu. And I guess going to what you had just spoken about, that is a genuine danger of people saying, well, I think he's going to be the prime minister anyway, but voting the other way, or voting for a different party, which would pull him out from a position to actually ascend to the premiership. Is that basically how I understand it?
Yeah, I think that's one element of what's going on. I mean, his standing as he's been, for 5 or 6 years, he's been seen as the best candidate to be prime minister. His lead over Herzog is smaller than it was, before the war in the summer. It's gone down, but he's still considerably ahead. But it's, if the perception is that he's going to be prime minister anyway, on peace and security, because that's what people think about most when they think about who should be prime minister. If they think he's going to do that anyway, they may vote on their second most important issue. Yesh Atid did very well on that basis last time. People who voted for Yesh Atid were not necessarily thinking that a more dovish approach on the peace process was what they were voting for, because indeed that wasn't their agenda. Yesh Atid, their agenda was primarily domestic. So I think that could be a factor this time as well. Absolutely.
So assuming that it is close, we've seen it precedented, there has been precedent where the Kadima party had one more seat than Likud a couple of elections ago, and yet President Peres turned to Netanyahu to set up the coalition. Is the relationship between Bibi and Rivlin relevant here, if that should come to a head? The question is, how relevant is President Rivlin in this discussion when it comes down to forming a government? Or if the numbers fall, as you say, they seem to be aligning up as they were before, nothing really changes, then it almost doesn't matter, because the left will not be able, if it falls out that way, the left won't be able to pull together a coalition anyway. It'll fall to the right, or the right will just have its slim margin of a coalition. How do you see the president's choices here affecting?
The key thing is what I said at the end. It's not just how many seats you've got, it's whether your bloc actually supports you. In other words, in theory, the right and the ultra-orthodox may have more than 61, but if members of that group, which normally hangs together, decide they're not hanging together, then that won't help Netanyahu. The key question that the president has to ask himself is who has the best chance of forming a coalition. He will consult with the leaders of all the parties, and he will, if it's, the clearer it is, the less relevant the relationship between Netanyahu and Rivlin. In other words, Rivlin will stick by the book. If Peres did, Rivlin will even more do so. And if it's clear that Netanyahu is the person who can form a coalition, Dept has got the best chance, he will ask him. If it's clear that somebody else is, then he'll ask them. The issue the place where it might come in is if it's not at all clear who can form the best coalition. And that is a possibility, that it will be unclear. And then he would probably give Netanyahu the first shot, because he's there, on the basis of that he is the prime minister. But in that case, we might end up with more of a kind of national unity government, because nobody has got nobody's got the capabilities. But that will be the hardest thing to predict. In other words, if Lieberman, for example, gets 9 seats, and he just says, well, I'm not recommending anyone for prime minister, then neither side will have 61. If Shas, and again, even more so, if Shas splits in half and half their votes go one way and half the votes, but no one will have 61. So then it's not clear who should be asked to form a coalition, and it's not clear who will be able to form a coalition, and it will be anyone's guess as to what happens. There'll be a lot of horse trading that would go on, and it's impossible to predict what the outcome will be, other than to say it'll unlikely to be a stable outcome. But that's the key thing, that if blocks don't cohere solidly, then the playing field becomes open, and it'll be very hard to know. Remember, no party is predicted to get even a quarter of the seats in the Knesset, so you have to put together, a multi-party coalition, and that is not going to be easy.
If I can ask you, when you vote in Israel, you vote for a party when it comes to the national election. Is it all about the leader of the party, whether it's Bibi, whether it's Shirtled Livni, Bennett, Kahlon, that's who you're voting for? In other words, does the makeup of the list itself have any effect on the electorate? There's been talk of Bibi fatigue. It is only, you don't get to be prime minister for so long in this country unless your name is Ben Gurion. And the fact that Bibi has been prime minister for so many years, first back in '96 and now the most recent time, does the list that the Likud, for example, has just come up with, which they claim to be a more center list, does that affect the average voter? That when he goes to the polls, say, well, I was thinking of going away from Likud for this, that, or another reason, but now that I see the list, this is more palatable to my voting preference.
The voting public in Israel votes on a range of issues and a range of factors that can't be put down to any one thing. Large parts of the electorate vote because they identify with a particular group, and they will vote for that group whatever. The base of Shas, the base of Bar-Ilan, the base of Yisrael Beitenu, the base of Labour. Of those groups that are in play that switch, leadership is certainly one factor, and certainly the makeup of the list is significant. I would say that it's more of a reason that can lose you votes than can gain you votes. You can gain by having some attractive candidates, but had Netanyahu's list contain people who are perceived as being more ideologically right as opposed to more sort of pragmatic, security center right, that would have opened up the Likud to criticism that would possibly have stuck, because the mainstream Israeli public, while it's relatively hawkish because it doesn't believe there's a chance of peace, is relatively dovish in what it's prepared to pay if there was peace. In other words, they're willing to pay a high price if they really get peace and security. It's just that they just don't believe that they will get peace and security. So if they perceive that a Likud list was full of people who are not willing to pay that price under any circumstances, then that may cause them to think twice. It was interesting that in the previous election, when Bar-Ilan had a candidate who made some rather extreme comments about the Temple Mount, Bar-Ilan number of seats fell in the next poll by 3 to 4 seats, and those seats jumped straight over Likud and ended up in Yesh Atid. In other words, because of the people who was voting on a domestic agenda, which at that point was similar between those two parties and not a foreign policy agenda. So you can lose votes if you're perceived to be extreme, and in that sense, I would say the Likud list is like ensures or prevents or blocks that line of attack that might have carried some weight from the centre and the left.
So now looking forward with an optimistic view from a Likudnik, that is, Helen Friedman of American Friends of for a Safe Israel asks, if Netanyahu and the Likud remain in the leadership of the country, can we hope that things like the destruction of Amona, she lists quite a few things there actually, the military closure of Od Yosef Chai Yeshiva, the threatened loss of Har HaBayit, and so many other things. Basically, the questions that she's asking, are these going to come to an end? What sort of changes can we see, or will there be any changes should the Likud and Bibi Netanyahu be back in the leadership with a more right coalition moving forward? Can you give us your sense of a projection? And I understand that it would be speculation. Would there be any changes moving forward, or would it be, as we've seen, business as usual?
I think it will be business as usual. I mean, I think the factors that push an Israeli government to feel the need to be credible about the willingness to make concessions will remain in place. And those are domestic. That's what the Israeli public thinks, mainstream. Doesn't mean they want the concessions made tomorrow, but they need to feel that potentially you're willing if. The same kind of pressure exists in the relationship with the US and with relations with European governments, not European publics. European governments are less anti-Israel, more pragmatic than European publics and Americans in general. But it's focus groups and polling all show that Israel's credibility and support for Israel, willingness to not levy sanctions on Israel, all of that is related to credibility about peace. In other words, that doesn't mean that everyone has to like Israeli policy or support everything, but they need to feel that if the other side was willing, then Israel would be willing. And I think that those two factors remain in place. There's a very high price to be paid for not standing by that. It buys Israel lots of maneuvering room when it needs to act militarily like it did against Hamas. It doesn't buy it flag-waving support, but it certainly buys it understanding and in the context of the way publics in Europe are more critical of Israel, unreasonably so. It's very interesting that leaders were willing to pay, in Britain and Germany, were willing to pay quite a significant domestic political price in order to support Israel because they fear the consequences of any kind of Islamist victory in the Middle East. And an Israeli government that at least appears to be willing in principle to make concessions makes their job easier, makes it easier for them to support Israel, and that helps Israel because it pushes away the threat that with the Palestinians going to the ICC and all that, those kind of governments are going to support those kind of measures. They will be looking not to support it. They'll be looking to sort of put it in a box and let it rot on the shelf, and they may make some window dressing comments here and there, but they'd really rather not go in that direction. So an Israeli government that allows them to claim that there might be a partner is one that serves Israel interests and allows it, therefore, to act more assertively militarily without the fear of consequences later on.
You mentioned the Palestinian desire to go to the Palestinian Authority, the desire to go to the ICC. Actually, a perfect segue to what I believe is going to be our last question of this conference call. And seeing as though you are a specialist and expert in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy as well as the Arab-Israeli peace process, U.S.-Israeli relations, and so on, the question is, can you comment perhaps on the PA's desire to go to the ICC from varying perspectives vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the U.S. and the EU?
Yeah, I think that it's clear to the Palestinians that a negotiated settlement with Israel, never mind Netanyahu, but with Olmert or Barak, with the Labour or the centre-left, whatever you want, will force them to make compromises that they are either unwilling or unable to make. I mean, you can take your pick whether the leaders are responding to public opinion or leading it. I mean, it's an open question. But it seems clear to me that they're just not prepared to bite the bullet on refugees and security, let alone the other things. The minimal conditions of Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak they can't meet. So that that being the case, they would like to get something for nothing, which is go the international route, try and get sanctions on Israel and all of that. And that is what lies behind this, I think. Luckily for Israel is the sense that the United States in general tends to think that it's about peace, not just about Palestinian rights, and therefore if they want those rights, then we want there to be a semblance of peace and security afterwards. So the Americans are really dead set against this kind of unilateralism. The kind of resolution that the Americans might have supported would have been one that would have spoken about a negotiated two-state solution based on the 67 lines. One which says after 2 years, if the Israelis don't agree with us, we impose sanctions, is not going to get American support, and it's not going to get a large measure of European support. because even European countries, at least some of them, are concerned with that kind of a thing, and really they also want a negotiated solution. So they might grandstand a bit to their parliaments and their publics, because the publics are more kind of emotionally anti-Israel and emotionally pro-Palestinian, so they play to that a bit. But governments who worry about the consequences of that kind of thing worry that it'll just cause more chaos and increased Islamism, and so they're not very keen on it. They much prefer a negotiated solution. I don't see an enormous international appetite for imposing sanctions on Israel, unless Israel does things which are considered by Europeans to be provocative, annexing something, some part of the West Bank, or a really major settlement drive, which is, when the European foreign minister lands or something like that. Those kind of things, but short of that, I think that this is, from a Palestinian point of view, another case of them never missing a chance to waste an opportunity.
And on that note, I want to thank you, Dr. Rynhold, for joining us. I want to thank all of you on the call. Remind you once again to go to our website, www.aslikud.org, and please renew your membership. Dr. Rynhold, it's been a pleasure speaking to you this evening. Thank you again for taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you when our groups are here in Israel, or perhaps even if you happen to travel to the United States. Thank you again, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.